A little bit about my story. 25 years ago, I was called to serve in children's ministry. And I came back to my church, and my children's ministry director immediately put me to work serving in the preschool ministry at our church. It was a medium-sized church, and over the years, that ministry grew to around 24 preschoolers. Well, God would see fit to move my family halfway across the country, and when He did, we found ourselves in a smaller church. At that smaller church, when I walked into the building for the very first Sunday, the pastor said, "We have a few kids that are here today, and we would like to know if you would mind taking them downstairs and presenting a lesson to them." Well, of course I did, because it's my calling and my heart. But over those next 4 years that I served in that children's ministry, it never grew more than a dozen kids or so at any given time. We would do outreaches, and we'd see a number of kids come from the neighborhood. Yet on Sundays, again, we never would have more than 10 or 12 kids. During those few years, God really showed me some unique and special things about small church children's ministry. And if I were to be honest with you tonight, I would say that having served in small, medium, and large-sized congregations, perhaps some of the lasting and greatest fruit that I have seen has come out of that ministry in that very small church. So tonight we're going to talk about children's ministry in the small church for the next few minutes. As a smaller church, I like to think about children's ministry kind of thinking about David and Goliath. Like David, I think we all know that story as children's pastors. We're familiar with it. But like David, we oftentimes stand in front of giants, in front of Goliaths. But as we know, every Goliath has a weakness. And I believe through the power of the Holy Spirit, through faithfulness, creativity, resourcefulness, and sometimes a little sweat, we can bring those obstacles to their knees. I like this about David. David wasn't concerned about what other people thought or what he couldn't do. Instead, David concentrated on what God could do through him. I think that's important to remember as small churches. And I think it's important to realize that there are a few common giants that we probably have already been battling in your smaller churches and others. One of those is volunteers. Smaller churches routinely suffer from a volunteer shortage and struggle to effectively staff their programs. We've heard of the 20-80 rule, 20% of the church does 80% of the work. And that's true, especially in smaller churches with fewer people. Money is a giant we all face. Smaller churches naturally have tighter budgets. In children's ministry, that often means having to walk away from some good and spendy programming. This ugly giant can cast a long shadow and can quickly spread to disappointment and even anger at times. Another Goliath that we face is attendance. Numbers are a continual source of disappointment and discouragement in the smaller church. Enthusiasm often wanes when we focus our minds on those raw numbers, pure data, plain statistics. We struggle with low turnout, poor attendance, and we plan, and sometimes nobody even shows up. This is a giant that if we're not careful, we'll start to focus more on who's not there than on the faithful few who do show up. Facilities and space. The lack of space is a huge obstacle, especially in children's programming. Children oftentimes need as much as 4 times the space as an adult. Many small churches put their children in leftover spaces. I've seen children's church in hallways, storage rooms, sometimes even attics. That's when the obstacle presents a particular problem. And finally, there's the giants of envy, isolation, and comparison. Contentment is hard to find in many small congregations, and if you're not careful, this giant will finish you off. It's easy to be envious of better facilities, bigger budgets, and larger churches. Sometimes smaller churches even criticize and condemn larger congregations, saying that they've sold out or they water down their message. The problem is if you're always looking at what another church has, you'll miss what God has given you. Envy, isolation, and comparison are open doors that the enemy uses. So over the next few minutes, I want to invite you to do a personal inventory of the giants that you might be facing in your local ministry. And hopefully in these next few moments, we'll discuss some ways that we can bring those giants and bring them down. The story of David, the shepherd boy, is an intriguing one to me. One thing is certain. David wasn't concerned about what other people thought or what he couldn't do. Instead, he concentrated on what God could do through him. His youthfulness and his small stature did not matter. So if you desire to energize your small church children's ministry, then I want to invite you to take a page from David's story. Too often we worry about what we can't do rather than to seek what God wants to do through us. We unnecessarily weigh ourselves down as we attempt to take on that larger church programming armor in facilities, in programs, even in mission. But instead, we must let our smaller church children's ministry be itself and cast aside all those fears that want to weigh us down. So let's take a look at some of those giants and some of the ways that we can hopefully bring them down. Volunteers. This is a big giant in a small church, isn't it? Well, I want to share with you some things that I would suggest that you not do. Number one, never stand in front of your congregation and make a plea for help. It's so tempting, isn't it, when we need help for us to get up in front of everyone and almost beg for them to join us or to serve us. We, called children's ministers who are enjoying this training, we do believe that children's ministry is a calling and it's something that we want to do. And oftentimes when we get up and beg for help, it casts a poor vision of our ministry. Never beg people individually to join your ministry. Again, this is a calling and we want it to be a pleasure for people to serve. We don't want people to feel like we've coerced them into serving, because chances are when we do that, then they ultimately will not stick around and be faithful volunteers that stay with us. And finally, never invite someone to join your ministry team unless you're confident in their abilities to serve in the role that you assign. Again, when we are so desperate for volunteers, we'll usually just stick a body into some leadership role. But when we do that, we often set people up for failure. So be sure that you can have confidence in the abilities of the people that you ask to serve. Now, here are some things that you can do. Be thankful for who you have and show appreciation often. A lot of times it's easier to keep a volunteer than it is to recruit a new one. So be generous with your thanks. Sometimes a simple thank you note. Every quarter I send thank you notes to my volunteers to thank them for serving. And I'll often hear from them that it has meant so much that they received that note, and it often comes at just the right time. Invest in them. Show your appreciation by investing in them. Hopefully your team has gathered together for this webinar, or maybe you've taken advantage of some of the training offered by children's ministries, like the Impact video training series. So invest in them. Show them your appreciation. Talk with other people about potential recruits in your church. You can ask around and see, is there someone that's not plugged into children's ministry who you would recommend serving? And invite people to become a part of your ministry almost as a fly on the wall. Ask people to just come and observe and to see what's going on. They might serve as a monitor in your children's ministry area to sit with you and help with some of the discipline of the children in the room while you're ministering. Oftentimes when people can just observe and see what's happening in children's ministry, they'll want to volunteer eventually. And finally, be sure to enlist your parents, teens, and preteens into your ministry. We often overlook these individuals who can serve. With parents, ask them to invest the time into the ministry to help you serve. And of course, preteens and teens will come alongside and often fit in many roles that other people will not fill for you. So let's bring that giant of volunteers down. Let's talk a little bit about money. This is a big issue for a lot of smaller churches. And what I would recommend to you tonight is make sure that you have a budget for your children's ministry. Now, I know in smaller churches you're probably laughing at me right now because you may not have a budget. But I believe that having a written budget helps to show where your ministry is going. It helps to make you accountable to your pastor, and it provides a structure for providing for the needs in your local ministry. Here's a few tips when we talk about budgets. Number one, carefully think through curriculum. Curriculum is so crucial to a children's ministry because it ensures the spiritual development of our children, and it ensures that they are learning something. As you're taking notes, I've got a couple of websites that I want to recommend to you at this time, and we'll include these on the chat on the page where you're viewing this webinar. The first one is newspringnetwork.com. It's a great resource that has themed children's curriculum that's available for free to you. It's curriculum that you can download that includes your sermons, your visuals, even media, video, and music supplies. So check out newspringnetwork.com. A second website is resourcewell.com. Again, this is free curriculum that you can use in your church. It goes on a 3-year cycle. So It cycles through every 3 years, and children get a total picture of the Bible. And it's very unique that it provides a number of songs that you can download. And in 3 years, your children can enjoy and learn over 60 Bible memorization verse songs. And finally, fishersofkids.com. That's another great website. It has a 1.5 years worth of curriculum that you can use in your ministry. So check out those 3 sources. I've already helped you with your budget because you don't have to invest in curriculum up front. But I encourage you to check out those websites. Also, another way to save money on curriculum, many of our churches right now, you may be sitting with other churches in your area or your district. A lot of our churches meet this time of year. Why not network with some of your area churches who have some curriculum just sitting on a shelf that has not had any life for a while? You can share your resources with each other. It's a great cost-saving method for investing in curriculum. And finally, I like to use social media. My church, we use curriculum, but I still supplement it by visiting sites like YouTube. If I need a video of, say, Zacchaeus up in the tree looking for Jesus, YouTube and Vimeo are great social media sites for downloading video content for your children's ministry. We also enjoy using Pinterest. Hopefully you have visited Pinterest. It's got some great ideas for crafts. Usually if you'll just type in the topic that you're teaching on any given Sunday, you can find some great craft ideas. And finally, Facebook is another wonderful tool. Two sites that I'll mention is the children's ministry site, Developing Leaders Impacting Kids, as well as another site is I Love Kid Men. These are 2 great Facebook pages where you can network with other children's ministers. So if you don't use any of those ideas, be sure that you set aside some money in a budget for curriculum, or you can visit some of these sites and use your money elsewhere. Number 2, invest into leaders. The best way to use some money in your budget is to invest in the adult leaders that are working in your programs. Invest in training and resources. Utilize some of these free training tools like the webinars. Invest in Impact, the DVD training series. It's a very inexpensive way to train all the ministry leaders in your church. Plan out your expenses each month in a budget. So you want to look at the total month of the budget year for your church, depending on when it begins and ends, and try to think through when will you be investing more money. For many of us, that would be times like Easter or Christmas, or if you plan back to school outreaches. So set up your budget, again, with each particular month in mind. Number 4, tip 4, keep it flexible. Be willing to move and adjust money as necessary in your budget. There are 7 categories in my budget. Those are local outreach, refreshment, volunteer appreciation, training, curriculum, promotion, and special events. Those are 7 categories that I've identified in my ministry that I want to spend money. And so again, we have those categories budgeted out over each month of the year. And also plan for income, okay? Plan to receive some funds. Perhaps you can receive offerings in your children's ministry that can go back into the ministry. Plan for donations from individuals in your church. Plan for fundraisers throughout the year. Whatever it might take in your small church to have the resources available to provide that ministry to your kids. Number 6, prioritize your funds. Make sure that you don't spend your money in your budgets on something that is not important to you. For me, whenever I've had a children's ministry budget, the most important areas are refreshments. But in addition to refreshments, I like to invest in volunteer appreciation and in training. And somewhere in the middle, I invest in resources and teaching aids, and then usually outreach promotion receives a lower priority in my budget. So prioritize your funds to make sure that whatever you have, you're using it wisely and to the greatest benefit and effect for the ministry. Run your budget by your volunteers, okay? They might help you see areas where you didn't realize that you were a little short-sighted, okay? And they're the ones that are closest to you in the ministry, and they can often help you allocate your funds appropriately. Number 8, and I think this is really important in a smaller church, be careful about mixing your own finances in with the money spent in children's ministry. Now, if God has placed a burden on your heart, or asks you to do something, certainly you want to follow his leading. But so often it's tempting for us to just continually put money out of our pockets into the personal children's ministry. And so we have to be careful about that. One of the ways that I have overcome this in smaller churches is with the approval of my pastor and treasurer to have a small checking account where I have a checkbook, the debit card that I can use for those expenses while I'm out. Another option might be to just have a small petty cash fund that you carry, $25 or so, where you're responsible to turn the receipts into your pastor or treasurer as money is spent. And number 9, don't be afraid to raise money and to ask for sponsorships. In a lot of the smaller churches, when I've been cautious about asking for funds, I've often found when I make the need known to the church, it somehow comes to realization. Okay, if you need a TV, if you need a VCR or a DVD now, DVD player, if you need a CD player, if you need puppets, whatever it is, make the need known to your church. And oftentimes you will see people willing to contribute. But don't be afraid to pursue fundraisers. We all know yard sales, bake sales, rockathons, all of these sort of fundraising ideas are effective in the smaller church in helping raise funds for your budget and your needs. So consider, if you don't have a budget, consider putting something together, even if it's small, even if it's $100 from your local church for the year. Begin moving toward having a written vision for your children's ministry. It will help you to be accountable, and it will help your church to see how you are spending funds and your vision for your ministry. Let's talk about attendance now. I think there are a couple of key factors in confronting the Goliath of attendance. And that is, number 1, build personal relationships with the kids that you're in touch with. Know who they are. Know what their interests are. Know where they go to school. And be willing to spend time apart from your ministry hour or two to invest in them and to know more about them. And equally as important as knowing the kids is to build relationships with the parents of the kids that you're in touch with. Know them as well. Interact with them. It's, again, one of those, as we were talking in the last session, the importance of people feeling safe with their children in your children's ministry. One of the greatest ways that they'll feel safe is to know you personally. And then remain in touch throughout the week. We have a lot of wonderful tools now, email, social media, texting, cell phones, that you can stay in touch with your families. Let them know throughout the week that you're thinking of them, you're praying for them. Share a funny story of what might have happened in your ministry on Sunday with them. But the importance with attendance is that it's not necessarily the quantity or the number of kids you're reaching, but the quality of the relationship that you're building with them. And finally, let's talk about facilities and space. We know that space in a small church is oftentimes at a premium, and many times we have to share spaces with other ministries. If you find yourself in that role, I want to encourage you to be supportive of your ministry. Don't make life difficult for the other ministries or your pastor, but be a good sport and work with whatever environment that you find yourself in. Work out a plan when you're sharing a space with someone. Let them know what's expected, when you can be in there, and when you'll be leaving or releasing the spaces during the week. If you share a space where there's lots of toys or lots of things that you don't want to be touched during ministry time, just remove them. Make sure that they're not in the space as you're ministering to children. And then create storage spaces if you can, if you're sharing a space in your classroom, items that you can pull out quickly and then put away at the end of your ministry time. So be a good sport when you have to share your facilities or spaces with individuals. If you don't have to share your space, but you're somewhat limited, then do what you can to make the environment something that's interesting to children. If you're able to paint, if you're able to decorate, invest some time and resource into making your environment something that's inviting for children. And finally, I just want to talk quickly about vision. A smaller church children's ministry has to envision what God can accomplish through a fervent reliance on God's power. Too many times we like to see the obstacles and we forget that it can be an opportunity for God. What we see as a barrier might really be God's eventual blessing, and what stands before us as a problem can probably be a possibility in disguise. When we look with our temporary eyes, we will often miss what's eternal. And God has an eternal plan for your ministry and for the children that you serve. So I want to encourage you, develop a vision statement. Share the vision of what you want to do in your local ministry. Make sure that it's something that you share with your pastor and that is in line with his vision for the church. And as you develop that vision and as you share it, others will come alongside of you and others will encourage you in your ministry. So in conclusion, the smaller church is different. So I want to encourage you to embrace your differences. The smaller congregation is unique with natural strengths and supernatural gifts that sometimes larger churches even envy. Unfortunately, smaller churches tend to assume that the work of a church with 1,000 people can be pared down to one of 100 or even 10. But the truth is that ministry through mimicry rarely succeeds. I think it also breaks the heart of God, who specializes in what's special in your local church. So celebrate your individuality as a smaller church. Dare to be different. Dare to be like David. Don't worry about your size and appearance, but focus your faith on God, who wants to watch you succeed. Seek to reach children around you and bring them into an authentic relationship with Jesus Christ, and rejoice in your strengths. I invite you as a small church, dream big, and I want to encourage you to not try to live beyond your size. A church of 60 can be a dynamic church of 60, just as well as a church of 600 can be a dynamic church of 600. God wants to use you to do miraculous things in the life of his children, so let's bring those Goliaths down.